Welcome to the Unveiled Epic Echoes channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery. In the hush of early evening, when the last light slides like a slow coin along the ridges of the Cascades, and the air tastes faintly of cedar and rain, the deep Oregon woods begin to move in ways that the busy world above rarely notices. You may think of trees as still and steady, rooted in patient permanence, but here, in a hollow valley folded between old volcanic slopes, they have a memory as soft as moss and as old as the moss-black stones that line the creek. They whisper names, not the names people call themselves in the quick, bright hours, but names that sound like lullabies and lost addresses. Names you haven't heard since childhood, when summers were long and afternoons stretched like gentle ropes. The forest keeps them, and sometimes, when the wind is a careful listener, those names find their way to wakeful ears. ELVIS came to these woods because of a story he could not forget. He was a historian by habit and a mapmaker by love, the sort of man who kept notebooks full of marginalia and maps where waterways were annotated with little questions. He had learned, in lecture halls lit by buzzing fluorescence, that every map is also a memory, every boundary a shorthand for what we've chosen to remember and what we have consented to forget. Yet in the quiet hours after teaching, ELVIS felt a hunger for something the archives did not hold, a living thread back to names and people who had vanished from public records but lingered in local rumor. An old orchard keeper with a crooked grin, a midwife who stitched secret poems into linens, a school teacher who taught children how to read the stars. The rumor that called to ELVIS was older than the county registrar or the gray official ledger books in his university basement. It was older than the town itself. The rumor said that deep in that valley, the trees spoke in names, and that once in a long while, the names they whispered could open doors, not of hinges and nails, but of remembering, of turning neglected histories and folded family tales into whole scenes with faces and seasons and the soft paper smell of lost letters. ELVIS is not the only one drawn by such promises. A botanist who measured leaves like confessions found the woods with a different ache. She wanted to listen to the language of the forest, to know if sap movement and root chatter formed a grammar of their own. There is also Jonah Pike, a retired logger with a jaw softened by time who carries in his pocket a tin harmonica that used to sing on rainy mornings in the bunkhouse. He carries guilt like a small stone. He had once felled an ancient cedar that his father had vowed never to touch. The three converge at a trailhead marked on no official map, where a hand-painted sign reads simply, "Enter with your name well in mind. The sign is newly painted, but the lettering is old-fashioned, the kind of hand that lingers in flourishes and doubts. At first, their reasons for coming are private lanterns held inside. They do not tell each other all the things that bring them loss, curiosity, an ache to recover lost syllables. They share coffee and silence, and the easy human ritual of making plans, while the sun still seems to remember how to stay. The path winds down through alder and fir, and a kind of spruce that smells of citrus when rain wakes it. As they walk, the forest shifts from being scenery to becoming a presiding mind. The light seems to sift more slowly. Birds become careful talkers. Under rocks, there are bones of small animals like punctuation marks in the leaf litter paragraph. The creek sings a measured, humming accompaniment. They set up camp near a ring of stones that seem to have once cradled a fireplace, and around that ring, ghost embers of other lives, charred kernels of wild hazelnut, a shard of green glass, a child's wooden button, speak tenderly of someone who once knelt there, lays out a small journal, and draws leaves with steady hands, knotting Venetian patterns as if they might be letters in a forgotten alphabet. Elias holds his map like a talisman, charting nothing but the shape of the valley and the thin line of the creek. And Jonah tunes the harmonica as dusk greases the sky. That first night, the trees do not shout. They do not need to. Their voice is the slow, irresistible accumulation of small sounds. A leaf sighing, the subtle now and again creak of bark, a spider leaping bright as punctuation. Under the thin cover of stars, each of them hears, like the turning of a page, a single name, barely audible and shaped like a bell beaten in a distant kitchen. Miriam. The name folds itself into sleep like a hand into a glove. In Elia's dream, she is a woman with flower-dusted palms who remembers how to make dough rise without measuring cups. In Stream Miriam is a tree with hair like wheat. In Jonah's dream, she hums an old hymn without a tune. The next morning, sunlight steady as a historian's hand, they find under the ring of stones a scrap of hand-sewn linen embroidered with the faded name Miriam tucked into a crevice. There are no visible footprints beyond the path, only a scattering of small, deliberate impressions, as if a dozen small creatures had danced there, and the linen is like a punctuation mark placed on the map of their curiosity. The forest is teaching them the first rule of its voice. Names arrive like sentences left in pockets. They do not always answer, but when they appear, they insist on being noticed. Over days, the valley reveals its archives slowly and with taste. The trees indeed whisper, They whisper not only names, but fragments, snatches of laughter, the scent of lilacs, a recipe for stew that uses too much sage and no apology, a bamboo flute left in a hollowed stump plays a melody when the wind passes like a hand across its mouth, a melody that turns into a calendar in its mind. This tune at the time of raspberries, that tune at the first snowfall, each sound is proof that the woods remember lives as carefully as a ledger remembers ledgers. Elias begins to record with a feverish, gentle hand, names the trees offer: Miriam, August, Nell, Ruth. Ben names that are ordinary enough to be familiar, yet arranged in such a sequence that they feel like keys in a pocket watch. He traces them on his map, writing them along trails and ridges, until the map becomes less a representation of topography than a catalogue of remembered lives. Who once thought plant language ended at photosynthesis begins to hear grammar, the way two furs exchange a soft scraping means the arrival of a child's laugh. The low, sustained hum of moss across a boulder means a new life has been welcomed. Jonah, who thought the trees only counted board feet and profit, hears instead a ledger of forgiveness. One evening, the three find a narrow path, almost erased, that the forest has kept out of habit more than memory. It leads to an old homestead clearing where the foundations of a cabin sit like a set of teeth in the ground. A bent cedar still stands guard nearby, and in its hollow someone has carved a name so many times that the wood is worn smooth. Elias, but not Elias, Elias. The carved letters have a different hand and a date. 1849. The presence of that name is a small, shimmering impossibility. How could a man with Elias' name be carved into a tree before Elias himself was born? The forest offers no immediate explanation, only another whispered fraction. Echoes come home not in order, but in need. They realize the woods have their own chronology, an internal calendar not governed by human clocks. Sometimes a name will return centuries after the last person who knew it had died, because someone in the present needed to remember. As they camp by the cabin foundations, the air thickens with a scent like toasted linen and damp paper. In the hollow of a rock, they find a bundle of letters wrapped in waxed cloth, each written in a different hand, each addressed to someone who is, until that moment, a ghost. One letter is from a soldier to a sister who had promised to plant roses behind the cabin. Another is from a midwife with instructions that sound like recipes for safety. A child's crude drawing of a bird is folded like a plea. The letters are not miracles, they are objects. Yet objects in this valley seem to be charged with an insistence. They leak names back into the world, like sunlight leaking back into a cold room. The letters also shift the tone of what they are experiencing. What had been a charming, mysterious phenomenon becomes an ethical question. What is the responsibility of remembering? Who owns a name that has been spoken back into the world by trees? The tree oak divides careful labor. Elias documents. Jonah listens for the moral contours of what it means to restore memory. But memory is never neutral. As they walk, other names arrive, names that prick like nettles. They find carved initials that belong to men who had been accused long ago of taking more than they had earned. They find a ledger that records a failed land claim and a child left at the side of the road. The forest's memory is not a polish that makes everything beautiful. It is human in its mischief and its cruelty, its tenderness and its capacity to forget. For every biscuit recipe, there is a confession. For every lullaby, there is a record of a wrong done and never righted. Within this honest archive lies the story that will change everything. The discovery of a stone marker, overgrown and nearly smothered by ivy, on which an unfamiliar language is etched. The letters are not English. They are older than the town plaques in the county, and older than the recorded arrival of settlers, whose work with plants taught her patience with slow growth, traces the grooves and finds, hidden within the carvings, a motif of a wave and a spiral, a mark that appears in several unexpected places: on a middle school map, in the margin of a missionary's journal kept in a dusty library, and on a shard of pottery in a museum whose curator thinks it's. The symbol becomes a needle they must follow across time. They begin to see a pattern in the whispering. The trees do not only remember people, but networks of belonging trades, seasonal migrations, shared names passed from one shore to another. There is an implication that before the maps were made, before parcels were signed and deeds recorded, people here belonged to movements and allegiances that modern law blurred into anonymity. They start digging carefully, legally beneath a hollowed knoll, and find a compact, deliberate arrangement of stones and shells. A marker for a place where gatherings once occurred, where stories were told, names were taught to young lips, and a memory of an older, ocean-facing people was kept alive inland. This discovery pushes the trio into the orbit of the wider world. News is, inevitably, a trickle that becomes a stream. A local historical society contacts Elias with polite alarm. A scientist hears through a colleague that has found unusual botanical signaling. Jonah's old bunkmate hears and spreads the story in the bars and at the feed store. and suddenly there is interest and then scrutiny. People come with good intentions. Journalists who want a headline, academics who want a paper, children who want a treasure. Some come with less flattering appetites. Developers who see a new kind of marketing for untouched wilderness, and land speculators who smell opportunity where names once lay like quiet embers. The tension rises as the forest, which had operated like a private library, becomes a public exhibit in people's imaginations. The trees, used to a patient, near invisible life, respond in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. A stand of alder refuses to drop its leaves, leaves that would have fed the soil and the creek in the spring. A yearling fir that had stood straight as a pencil bends slightly away from a new trail. People begin to notice small misfortunes. Tools left in clearings vanish. A parked car's windows fog, as if breathing were harder when it lies too long near a particular copse. The spirit of the valley is not vengeful, rather. It draws attention to the idea that memory is a delicate thing. When exposed to the bright, clumsy hands of commerce, Elias and Jonah find themselves in the center of a moral debate. Is it right to bring this place into public life where everything becomes data, marketed, and monetized? Or is it right to let history remain private, accessible only to those who happen upon it by accident? The forest offers them another whisper, one that is louder than most. The name of a woman who had been a keeper of gatherings, a name spoken like honey, like a promise, A&A. The whisper comes with the warmth of an ember placed back in a hearth. In the hollow of a gnarled oak, they find a leather-bound book, its pages brittle, its ink smudged by time and water. It is not the kind of book a developer or a tourist would care for. There are no spectacular relics or jewels within, only lists of names, remedies, songs, and the sort of foot-stamped, earth-stained practical wisdom that communities pass among themselves. The entries read like minutes of gatherings, in which the keeper recorded who had come and what had been discussed, the weather, the debt owed by one neighbor to another, whether the winter stores had been enough. The book belongs to who is long gone, but whose voice is bright in the margins. As Elias reads, he feels the hair on his arms lift. This is more than artifact. It is an ethic. The book's final pages, ragged at the corners, contain a cautionary note. If the names ever come unbound, if the living take them as trophies rather than obligations, the valley will do what valleys do. It will close like a shell. The trio is then forced to reckon with the highest stakes the forest can present. The possibility that in making memory public, they might make it vulnerable to erasure in another form, fame. They must craft a way to honor the valley that does not expose it to exploitation. The tension reaches a quiet but sharp climax at a town meeting held in the old school gym, where banners hang like dust-laden sentences. The room is full of people pressing their palms to coffee cups and opportunity. Some speak for preservation, some for access. Elias stands and speaks with the soft, organized voice of a historian who has learned that narrative is a public responsibility, reads passages from his book about the obligations tied to names, how remembering a person meant feeding their descendants in a metaphorical and sometimes literal sense. Jonah, who has spent his life where trees were measured only by their sale value, offers a simple, tactile argument. Memory cannot be reduced to signage and tour. It must be integrated into obligations, land trusts, guardianship plans, and a rhythm of returning. A compromise emerges, one that does not please everyone. The valley will be protected by a community stewardship model. Access will be limited and slow. Processes will be put in place to ensure that names are not taken as tokens of experience, but asked for with humility and returned with accountability. The agreement requires sacrifice. Potential tourism revenue will be surrendered in favor of a long-term stewardship fund maintained by the community. In the end, as decisions are made and documents signed, the valley seems to breathe a long, green breath of relief. But the forest has one final surprise, a twist in the narrative that is both small and immense. In the spring after the agreement, when the valley is quiet again, and the map that Elias carries is inked with care, notices that the sap of the cedars is running a faint, luminous color she has never seen before. It looks for a moment like the soft glaze of a pressed blossom when she tastes a drop from a twig, a practice she performs with the academic caution of someone who has read every warning. She is flooded with an image, a coastline she has never stood upon, children running their hands in tidal pools, voices calling the names that the trees had been whispering. For who had thought the inland woods were cut off from ocean memory? It is a revelation. The valley's story is not merely localized. It is part of a larger weave connecting rivers to shores, mouths to mouths, names passed in migration like heirloom seeds. This final revelation reframes everything. The forest is not a guardian of discrete names, but a living archive stitched to other archives by the subtle migrations of people, plant knowledge, and trade. The names are threads in a wide tapestry, and because the valley's voice had been coaxed into a cautious public life, these threads gain new possibilities. Family histories are reknit. Lost kin find each other across counties. And the local school, adopts a curriculum that teaches children that names are both rights and responsibilities. Years pass in rhythms like breath. Elias returns to his university with new humility and begins a course where the final project is not a paper, but a stewardship plan. Research on plant signaling blossoms into a collaborative project that respects indigenous knowledge and grounds scientific methods in reciprocity. Jonah, penitent and content, teaches chainsaw safety and forest ethics to new hires, insisting they learn listening as well as measurement. The deep Oregon woods, protected and respected, continues to whisper names, but the whisper transforms. It is no longer a voice of secret, solitary archives. It hums instead like a choir, joining with songs from other places. People come and stand quietly, speaking names aloud, and following the small ritual that once taught. Speak the name. Remember what you were taught about that person. And then, in a practical act of care, plant something, an herb, a berry, a willow cutting, whatever makes sense for the place. These are not grand gestures, but granular acts that weave remembering into the daily work of caring. The valley never becomes famous in the loud way that ruins do. It becomes, quietly, a center of responsible memory, a model for how communities can make space where the past is not turned into product, but is honored as an active duty, the final surprise, the one that closes the circle in a way that feels inevitable and right, arrives not in a document or a law, but in the small hands of children. Years later, a group of sticky with jam and full of the unconcerned bravery of youth, come to the ring of stones, carrying a quilt stitched from leftover fabric and scraps. They call out names, some that the forest has supplied, and some they invent in the compassionate way children create ancestors of their own. And then, with solemn mischief, they tuck the quilt into the hollow of the cedar that once bore the name ELIAS and whisper, "We remember you." The cedar, which had witnessed so many comings and goings, holds the quilt like a literal and metaphorical heart. The trees keep whispering, but their voice is now a public tending as much as a private treasure. In the last light of an autumn that smells of apple cores and wood smoke, Elias and Jonah sit on a log by the creek and listen. The names come, soft as moth wings. Miriam, August, Nell, and many others that had been tenderly coaxed back into being. There is a new name as well, whispered low, and with delight, the name of a child, the child of one of those who had once been a ghost in a letter. The valley has become a place where names can travel home. It is a place where remembering is a work of daily love. As the creek moves on, as seasons continue their wise and patient turning. The deep Oregon woods remain an archive in motion, teaching anyone who cares to listen that memory is less an act of retrieval than of relationship. The last thing the trees teach, in a voice that is neither moralizing nor clement, but steady as roots, is simple. Names are not trophies to display, but promises to keep. The whisper of promises beneath the cedar deepened into a low, velvety hum that drifted across the forest floor like a warm exhale. And for a long moment, the entire valley seemed to breathe with it, as if satisfied that another thread had been woven into its living tapestry. Night gathered slowly, not with drama, but with a gentle folding of light, the way a mother might fold a blanket over a sleeping child. And the creek's voice softened into something like a lullaby. Elias watched the sky shift into its deeper blues, feeling the familiar but still astonishing sense that the woods were aware of him, not individually, but as part of a long chain of listeners who had come before. Leaned back against a moss-rich stump and closed her eyes, feeling the roots below her carrying quiet messages, the way old male roots once carried letters across prairies and mountain passes. Jonah tapped a slow, thoughtful rhythm on the metal of his harmonica without playing it, as if keeping time with something ancient drifting in from beyond the tree line. Slowly, the whispering changed. The trees did not fall silent. Instead, their voices thinned into threads, weaving themselves into a single, elongated note that trembled across the air. It was something new, something none of them had heard in all their months of wandering and listening. A sound that carried not a name, but a question. The question arrived without words, more feeling than language, but unmistakable. Are you ready for what comes next? A soft breeze curled across their camp, lifting the loose edges of Elia's map and rattling the dried leaves in his hair. Jonah looked up first, eyes narrowing as if he recognized the shape of something just beyond the visible world. From the far side of the clearing, past where the creek bent around a fallen log that looked like the spine of a great sleeping animal, a glow began to rise. It was faint, like the first shimmer of sunrise caught prematurely in a mirror. Then it grew steady, patient, warm. It illuminated the understory from below, outlining ferns like delicate lace and painting the trunks of the cedars in amber. Stood with a slow, dreamlike grace, compelled not by fear, but by recognition. It's not fire, she whispered, though none of them had thought it was. Elias stepped beside her, feeling the hum of the valley gather behind his ribs like a second heartbeat. The glow continued to swell until a shape emerged within it, tall, braided by shadows and light, neither quite human nor entirely tree. It was as though the forest had decided, for the first time, to speak not in whispers carried by wind, not in echoes printed on bark or threads of root murmur, but in form. A figure composed of soft radiance stepped forward, its edges shifting like leaves seen through bright water. It carried no face, yet it emanated presence. It expressed age older than the settlers, older even than the deep migrations whose traces the trio had uncovered. The figure paused before them, the glow settling around its shape like a settling of old dust. The hum returned, gentle, low, familiar now, and with it came the faint outline of voices, many voices, layered into a single chord. Elias felt a pressure behind his eyes, not painful, but expansive, as if a story long buried were unfurling itself in the dark of his mind. Images blazed across his inner vision, coastlines shifting over centuries, travelers crossing forests with names carried like lanterns, gatherings at stone circles lost to erosion, children planting seeds whose descendants still whispered through the moss, families building shelters near the old cedar where once stood. He felt the passage of storms that had carved ravines, fires that had both destroyed and rebirthed life, hands passing knowledge hand to hand in lineages longer than anyone living could trace. Felt it too flowing into her like warm water, filling a vessel, revealing the deep lineage of relationships between humans and plants that predated any modern science. Connections grounded not in study, but in reciprocity. Jonah, his breath tight, saw the faces of loggers and caretakers, of people who had misunderstood the woods and people who had cherished them, of mistakes and forgiveness braided into a single story. The figure's light pulsed softly, then steadied, and then the sound shifted again. Not a name, not a question, but a request, a plea, a calling, not for help nor for secrecy, but for continuity. The valley wanted to entrust them with something more than history, something closer to guardianship. Elias stepped forward first, though he did not fully understand why. "We're listening," he murmured, a simple phrase that felt small but right. The glow intensified, and from the center of the figure's chest, something slowly emerged, an orb the size of a river stone, pale and glowing, with a soft blue-green light that pulsed like a distant heartbeat as it drifted toward Elias, then toward and Jonah. They realized it wasn't an object at all. It was a memory seed, a piece of the valley's oldest story, condensed into a form small enough to carry, yet powerful enough to reshape everything they understood. When the seed hovered between them, the figure stepped back, the glow dimming around its form, until it blended again with the trees. The seed hung in the air, waiting. Elias reached out his hand, placed hers over his. Jonah, after a slow breath, added his calloused palm. The moment their hands formed a circle, the seed dissolved into a warm, radiant mist that sank into their skin like dew into soil. A shockwave of sensation unfurled through them. Emotion, memory, responsibility, and something like love. The forest exhaled around them, relieved, grateful, trusting. In the silence that followed, none of them spoke. There was no need. They had been given a charge, a continuation of a story older than any of them had imagined. The creek murmured softly, almost amused, as if welcoming them into a larger, deeper truth. Above the treetops, stars began to appear, slow, deliberate, ancient witnesses to what had just shifted in the world below. And as the night deepened, the whispering resumed, not as names now, but as guidance, gentle and steady. As the forest prepared to reveal the next layer of its long-kept secrets, the forest accepted their silent agreement, the way deep waters accept a stone without splash, without ceremony, but with ripples that travel farther than eyes can follow. Though nothing visibly changed in that moment, all three of them felt the shift. A subtle widening of the air, a loosening of something once tightly guarded, a new warmth in the cool breath of the valley. The trees, so often calm in their ancient watchfulness, seemed to lean closer, as if listening for the next steps the three would take now that the memory seed lived within them. Elias felt its presence first as a faint hum beneath his ribs, like an instrument tuning itself in the soft dark. It wasn't a voice yet, not exactly, but a resonance, an echo of something that had waited a long time to be carried again by human hands. Felt it in her palms, a gentle tingling that reminded her of the first time she'd learned how roots whisper water locations to one another. Jonah felt it deep in his bones, like the memory of a song his father used to hum before dawn in logging camps, far from any place a child should have worked. But none of them were afraid. The valley had chosen them, and that certainty held them steady. Above them, the night opened wider. Stars arranged themselves in patterns that seemed unusually coherent, almost intentional, as if the sky itself had brushed aside its habitual randomness to show the outlines of a constellation forgotten by modern astronomy. Tilted her head, trying to decode the pattern. It looked like a spiral wrapped around a series of branching lines, a symbol she recognized from his journal, though herself had never explained it. The discovery warmed his heart with an old academic thrill, mixed with an almost childlike wonder. A sign across centuries aligning with purpose. Elias stepped toward the creek, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. Each footfall felt guided, as if the earth were showing him where to land. When he reached the edge, the water glimmered with reflections not caused by moonlight alone. Ripples bore faint traces of shapes, faces, tree rings, maps stirring beneath the surface. Elias knelt, cupping his hand into the cold flow, and the water shimmered upward in a swirl of flickering scenes. A shoreline, a gathering of people around a fire, a woven basket being passed from hand to hand, a child holding a carved wooden charm shaped like a leaf. Every image glowed with the same gentle light as the memory seed, and Jonah came to stand beside him, drawn by the quiet awe in his face. The creek continued to pulse with visions, but as leaned in, the images shifted to something she could understand best. Plants that no longer grew in the valley, leaves shaped like elongated raindrops, stems marked by patterned ridges. She recognized species from coastal ecosystems hundreds of miles away. Plants that should not appear in the dreams of inland forests. Yet here they were, preserved in memory as clearly as pressed specimens in a botanist's book. Jonah's visions were different still. The water showed him wooden shelters half collapsed by storms. Men and women working side by side in the early light. Tools crafted from stone and bone long before sawmills arrived. He saw groups moving gracefully through the valley, marking the land with respect, carving symbols not for ownership, but for orientation, maps that belonged to everyone, meant to guide rather than divide. Then the water stilled, its glow dimming, until it was once again just a creek slipping quietly between stones. The three stood together, breath mingling in the cool night, each processing the fragment they had been granted. "It's telling us where the story began," Elias murmured, voice barely above a whisper, nodded slowly, or reminding us of the parts that were forgotten. Jonah rubbed the back of his neck. Feels like a warning too, like the valley, showing what happens when memory slips away. The trees rustled in gentle agreement, branches shifting with a soft wooden sigh. They returned to their campfire, though none of them felt the need for heat. The inner glow of the seed, even diffused among them, was calming, steadying. Elias unrolled his map again, but this time the inked lines looked incomplete. They were the skeleton of the land, measured and neat, but lacking the living curves the valley had just shown him. Without question, without even consciously deciding, he dipped a fingertip into the creek and let the dampness touch the map. The paper shimmered faintly. New lines began to emerge in pale strokes. Old trails marked by people who had walked the land long before surveyors, pathways that wound like threads toward the coast and back again, a network of stories, ecosystems, families, all braided across a region modern maps had reduced to mere boundaries. His eyes widened. It's giving us the old paths. Jonah let out a soft whistle, and maybe showing us the new ones. The night deepened around them, filled with quiet invitation. The valley had shared its memory. Now it waited for their next step. When morning came, the mist drifted low along the ground, like a blanket still half asleep. Sunlight filtered through the high branches in slow, honeyed beams. Birds began their songs in scattered waves, and chipmunks darted between shadows with the self-importance of tiny caretakers, ensuring the world ran on schedule. But beneath all that familiar forest life, the shift from the night before still hummed. The ground felt warmer, the air gentler, the trees more awake. The memory seed within them pulsed with tiny tugs, pointing them in a direction beyond the mapped trails. They followed. The path they walked was not new, though none of them had ever seen it. The earth held the faint indentation of footsteps centuries old, softened by moss, preserved by kindness. Ferns brushed at their legs like greeters familiar with the custom of bowing. Birds followed overhead in slow arcs, as though escorting them to a ceremony. Hours passed in serene silence before they reached a clearing unlike any they'd encountered. It was circular, perfectly so, as if shaped by deliberate hands over generations. At its center stood a stone pedestal carved with symbols that matched those in its journal. And in the visions, the creek had shown them. Around the pedestal, the ground dipped slightly, forming a natural amphitheater, and the trees surrounding it leaned inward, perhaps from wind, perhaps from reverence. The clearing felt like a heart, approached first, drawn to a cluster of carvings resembling plant stems. ELVIS circled to examine the geological markings, some worn smooth by time. Jonah stood back, sensing the weight of the place. On the pedestal lay a single object, a wooden ring, perfectly preserved despite its age, carved from the heartwood of a cedar. Inside the ring were etched dozens of names, not as a list, but arranged in spirals, overlapping and intertwining, weaving toward the center. Some names they recognized from the valley's whispers. Others were unfamiliar, holding the soft curve of old languages. ELVIS touched the ring gently. As soon as his fingers brushed the wood, the clearing came alive. Light spilled upward from the pedestal in slow, mesmerizing strands, swirling above their heads like ribbons of dawn. The trees responded with a low, harmonic resonance. Sounds rose from the earth. Drums, footsteps, laughter, the call of hunters, the lullabies of mothers, the rhythmic tapping of tools shaping stone. Ghostly silhouettes drifted across the clearing, people gathering, teaching, sharing stories, marking time not by years, but by harvests and migrations. The clearing was showing them a gathering place, a council older than any written record, a tradition that relied not on hierarchy, but on continuity, each generation receiving the memory seed, tending it, adding to it, and passing it forward. But then the visions changed. Storm clouds rolled in. Fires swept across ridges. Floodwaters carved new paths while burying old ones. Migrations scattered families. Settlers arrived. Names were lost. Some whispered into trees for safekeeping. Others forgotten entirely. The ring was carried through it all, passed from hand to hand, until eventually it was hidden beneath the stone pedestal for the right people to find again. The light dimmed. Silence settled. Elias rested both hands on the ring, humbled, placed her hand atop his. Jonah followed, completing the circle once again. The valley accepted this. Wind swept through the clearing, not cold, but bracing, as if preparing them for something even larger, something beyond the forest itself. The memory seed pulsed warmly in response. The ground beneath them seemed to breathe. Elias exhaled. This is just the beginning. Nodded. The story is much bigger than the valley. Jonah glanced toward the distant horizon, where the trees parted slightly, and it's guiding us somewhere else. The path ahead was not yet visible, but they could all feel it, pulling gently, steadily, like a tide returning to shore after a long absence. The valley had given them its truth. Now it was time to follow where the truth led. The pull from beyond, the clearing grew stronger with each breath, like a quiet thread tugging at the corners of their awareness, woven from memory older than language. The valley, having given them its deepest secret, now seemed to whisper not with urgency, but with gentle insistence, as though reassuring them that whatever lay ahead was part of its design, part of a story once paused and now ready to continue. The wind circled the clearing in a slow spiral, stirring the edges of Elia's map. When he unrolled it again, the new lines, the ancient paths revealed the night before glowed faintly in the morning light. One path in particular, arcing northwest through the densest part of the forest, pulsed softly, marking itself as the one meant to be followed. None of them questioned it. They stepped into the forest once more, and the trees seemed to open for them, shifting subtly so that the path became unmistakable. It felt like walking deeper, not just into the land, but into time itself. Sunlight filtered through high canopies in warm, golden shafts that moved as slowly as drifting lanterns. The air was thick with the scent of cedar, damp earth, and something, an herbal aroma neither nor Elias recognized, as though the forest were beginning to release memories in scent the way it had released visions in water. Hours passed in a dreamlike rhythm. The forest around them became older, the trees thicker, their bark roughened by centuries of weather. Moss clung to trunks in long, trailing beards. Brooklets trickled between roots like whispering scribes taking notes. Occasionally, a name drifted on the breeze soft, almost shy. But these were not the names they had heard before. They were older, layered with syllables shaped by tongues long gone. At midday, when the sun reached its highest point, they came upon a strange formation. 3 massive stones standing upright in a loose triangle, each one covered in markings carved so faintly they looked like shadows rather than etchings. Stepped close, fingertips brushing moss aside. Underneath, the carvings revealed themselves, patterns of spirals, waves, animal shapes, and sets of lines that resembled ancient calendars. A shiver ran through her, not cold but recognition. These markings, they match the ones in the coastal sites I studied during grad school, she whispered. But those places are miles from here. How could the same carvings appear inland? Jonah pointed to the spirals. Those look like the ones burned into the rafters of an old fishing shed my father took me to when I was young. He said they were marks left by people before the settlers came. Elias circled the stones slowly, studying the alignment. These aren't random. They're arranged like a compass, 3 directions, pointing to 3 different regions. One toward the coast, one toward the mountains, one toward the valley we came from. He stepped back, letting the realization settle. This was a crossroads, a meeting point among different groups, a place where knowledge flowed freely. As if responding to his words, the ground beneath the stones vibrated faintly, the tremor subtle yet unmistakable. The symbols on the stones glimmered briefly in the sunlight, lighting up like embers. Then the trees began to sing. It wasn't music in any traditional sense, not a melody or rhythm, but a layering of sounds, the rustle of leaves, the creak of trunks, the murmur of wind weaving through branches. Together, they created a sonorous, resonant sound that rose into the air like a chant. The 3 travelers stood motionless, overcome by the beauty of it. Elias felt tears on his face without remembering the moment they began, clutched her notebook to her chest, overwhelmed by the realization that she was hearing something no living scientist had ever documented. Jonah removed his hat, bowing his head as though at a sacred ritual. The forest song continued for several minutes, swelling and then shrinking until it faded into silence once more. When the last note dissolved, the path ahead, the one leading northwest, flared with clarity, as though outlined by the retreating light. The message was unmistakable. They followed. As the forest thinned, the terrain shifted. The ground sloped downward into a valley deeper than the one they had come from. A place so hidden that even satellite images would struggle to capture it. The air here was cooler, touched by a faint mineral scent. Shadows lingered longer, and the silence felt weighted, not ominous, but expectant. At the center of this new valley lay a lake perfectly still, its surface mirror-like, reflecting the sky so clearly that it looked like a piece of fallen heaven. Ringing the lake stood dozens of tall cedar pillars, each carved with a name in both ancient and more recent scripts. Some names Elias recognized from their earlier encounters. Others were entirely new, but all were beautifully preserved, as though the wood refused to let time erode them. Stepped to the edge of the lake and knelt. The water was impossibly clear. Beneath the surface, she could see what looked like stones arranged in deliberate patterns, almost like the foundations of old structures long submerged. And then she realized they were structures, buildings, pathways, a whole settlement resting beneath the water. She gasped. Elias, Jonah, look. They joined her, eyes widening as they took in the underwater world. Homes, communal halls, courtyards arranged around circular spaces similar to the clearing with the pedestal. Everything preserved in perfect stillness, untouched by decay. How did it get submerged? Jonah whispered. Elias studied the shoreline. A flood, maybe. A long one. The creek systems could changed course centuries ago. The valley above might redirected water into this basin. Shook her head slowly. But the preservation is too perfect. Floods destroy. This looks chosen. The memory seed pulsed inside all three of them once, twice, thrice. Then the lake began to shimmer. Light rose from beneath the surface, soft and luminous, illuminating the underwater structures in detail. Roofs glowed like lanterns. Pathways shined like veins of silver. The lake's entire body seemed to vibrate with its own quiet heartbeat. And then figures appeared, translucent silhouettes walking the submerged pathways, tending fires that no longer burned, teaching children whose echoes still lingered in the water. They were not ghosts, not entirely. They were memories, living imprints, echoes preserved by the valley's oldest form of magic. One figure approached the surface, pausing directly beneath where the trio kneeled. It looked up, though its features were soft, indistinct. Its presence was unmistakably calm and wise. It lifted a hand, and the water rippled outward in concentric circles that spread across the lake. A voice rose not from the air, but from within the water itself, soft, deep, melodic. You who carry the seed, welcome home. The three froze, breath caught in their throats. The figure continued, its voice like distant thunder, softened by sleep. We waited for the day when the story would return to its keepers. We waited for hands willing to bear memory, not for glory, but for care. The water shimmered again, showing scenes of the ancient settlement alive in its prime, people exchanging knowledge, cultivating plants recognized from her visions, carving the cedar pillars standing around the lake. Your journey is not to restore us, the water voice said gently. We do not need restoration. Your journey is to carry our memory forward, so that the land remembers itself. Elias felt the weight and the honor of the task settle into him, grounded and heavy, yet uplifting. Jonah whispered, "What do we do?" The figure raised both hands. The lake brightened. "Learn," it said. "Listen and follow the path beyond this valley. There is a truth that sleeps beneath the mountains. It waits for the seed bearers." The light dimmed. The figure dissolved into ripples. The lake fell still. The cedar pillars around them whispered in unison. A name none of them had heard before, long, melodic, ancient. Elias repeated it under his breath, felt it settle into her bones. Jonah felt the stir of courage. The path forward was clear, and so they turned from the lake, from the submerged city, from the cedar guardians, ready to walk deeper into mysteries older than any map, older than memory itself. They left the lake with slow, deliberate steps, not from fear, but from reverence, as though turning their backs too quickly might disturb the stillness that had preserved an entire forgotten world. The trees around the valley bowed inward slightly as they passed, branches dipping like respectful nods. Even the wind seemed careful, stirring only lightly through the cedar pillars, as if guided by the remnants of ancient ritual. The path beyond the lake was narrower than the ones they'd followed before, winding tightly between towering trunks, roots coiling like sleeping serpents beneath a carpet of needles. It felt untouched by recent footsteps, shaped only by the slow, patient gait of deer or the silent glide of owls. Yet the memory seed within them pulsed with a steady rhythm, urging them onward. Elias noted the change immediately. The forest's voice had deepened. The whispers were no longer short impressions or names, carried faintly on passing breezes. Now they came as layered murmurs, like hundreds of quiet conversations overlapping at a distance, telling pieces of stories, fragments of songs, cautionary warnings, laughter echoing from gatherings long dispersed by time. It felt as though the valley had expanded its voice, no longer whispering just into the trees, but into the very air around them. The terrain sloped upward gradually. The trunks grew thicker. Moss blanketed everything. Soon the forest began to tilt into mountainous country. Large stones jutted from the earth like ancient vertebrae. The air sharpened with altitude, carrying the cool bite of snow from peaks still hidden behind dense foliage. Paused beside a cluster of unfamiliar plants growing between rocks, their stems thin and silvered, their leaves shimmering faintly despite the shade. She knelt, brushing her fingers across the foliage. A rush of warmth spread from her fingertips to her chest, and the plant's scent, earthy but subtly sweet, triggered a memory she had never lived. A group of people harvesting these same plants under the guidance of elders, grinding them into poultices for winter ailments, storing them in woven baskets lined with cedar bark. The seed was showing her more. They used this as medicine, she murmured, voice hushed. For fever, for breath troubles, for long journeys through cold places. Elias and Jonah exchanged glances. They didn't question it. Everything in this forest came with knowledge attached, embedded like roots in soil. They continued until the trees began to thin. Ahead, the forest opened onto a wide expanse of granite, the beginning of a mountainside rising at a steep angle. A river, narrow and rapid, flowed along the base of the slope, cutting through the rocks with a voice far louder than the soft whispers they had grown accustomed to. The water's roar reverberated through the valley like a drumbeat calling the land to attention. Jonah approached it first, studying the current. The river was too strong to wade, too fast to cross, but something about its movement felt controlled, almost rhythmic, as if following a hidden pattern. There, Elias said, pointing upstream. A set of flat stones protruded from the water in a precise line, not random, not natural. Each stone bore faint carvings, worn nearly to invisibility, but recognizable enough to match the spirals and wave symbols they had seen earlier. A crossing. They moved deliberately, stepping stone to stone. As they crossed, the vibrations of the river seemed to travel into their legs and through their bodies, like a coded message being transmitted by the water. Felt it most clearly. The current spoke in pulses that matched the rhythm of the memory seed. When they reached the other side, the air changed. The forest grew silent, not empty, not dead, but as though deliberately holding its breath. The trees were spaced more evenly, their shapes more symmetrical. Light filtered through the canopy with uncanny precision, forming geometric patterns on the forest floor. Circles, intersecting lines, spirals. Nature itself was arranging the world with intention. Elias knelt, tracing one of the circles with his fingertip. "This isn't natural," he whispered. "This is design. Very old design." Above them, tucked between mountain peaks, loomed the entrance to a cavern, an arched opening framed by stone pillars, carved with symbols of such complexity that even Elias, who had studied ancient languages his entire adult life, couldn't interpret them at a glance. The pillars were cracked with age, but still magnificent, and the archway seemed to hum softly, as though breathing in harmony with the valley. The memory seed pulsed again. Stronger, Jonah took a cautious step forward. "It wants us to go in." The cavern swallowed sound as they entered. The world narrowed to the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the soft drip of mineral water from high above. Their lantern beams danced across walls layered with paintings, figures holding torches. Groups gathered around a single glowing object, children being taught by elders. The imagery was not primitive. It was deliberate, symbolic, sophisticated, a written language of pictures meant to preserve stories when words alone could not bear the weight. As they moved deeper, the cavern widened into an enormous chamber. A domed ceiling soared above them, glittering with mineral deposits like frozen starlight. In the center of the chamber stood a raised stone platform engraved with concentric circles. Upon it lay another ring, this one larger, older, and not made of wood. Stone polished smooth over centuries of handling, carved with hundreds of interlocking names in many languages, some recognizable, some extinct, some so old they felt more like sounds than words. Elias stepped forward reverently. His breath caught. The ring vibrated softly, responding to the presence of the memory seed now housed within the three of them. Felt it too, a somber resonance humming against her chest. Jonah laid a hand on the stone surface, and the vibration grew warmer. They were connected. The chamber flickered with light, not from torches, not from reflection, from memory. Scenes burst across the stone walls, thousands of years of gatherings. Knowledge exchanged between groups from coast, valley, mountain, desert. A coalition of cultures bound together, not by dominance or conquest, but by shared stewardship of memory. The ring in the cavern had once been the central ark of knowledge, tended by generations of chosen keepers. And the valley, the cedar lake, the ancient paths, those were pieces of a network built not to hold power, but to hold truth. But then came division, a great storm, a long winter, conflict between groups who once cooperated. knowledge scattered. Some protectors carried fragments of memory into forests. Others hid theirs in mountains. Others still entrusted it to the waterways. The world fractured. The network fell silent. Until now, the chamber dimmed. The stone ring glowed. Then a deep voice, not a person's voice, not a ghost's, rose from the cavern walls themselves. Slow and resonant, like the groaning of tectonic plates. You who carry the seed, stand as one. Elias stepped onto the platform, joined him. Jonah followed, forming a triangle around the central ring. A warm wind rose from the stone. Light spiraled upward. Their vision blurred. The memory seed awakened fully. A wave of sensation crashed over them. Every forgotten story, every lost name, every quiet act of love or bravery or sacrifice preserved in the valley. And the mountains poured into them like rivers converging into an ocean. Their legs trembled, their hearts thundered, their minds expanded with the weight of ancient truth. The voice spoke again. Will you carry memory into the world beyond these mountains? Not as relics, not as artifacts, but as living obligations. Elias felt the question settle into his bones, felt it bloom in her heart. Jonah felt it anchor itself in his spirit. They did not hesitate. Yes, the three murmured, each voice merging with the others. The cavern responded with a radiant pulse. The stone ring dissolved into shimmering dust that swirled around them like a warm storm, sinking into their skin, their breath, their consciousness. The platform beneath them glowed with deep gold, then faded. The seed had merged with the ring. They were no longer carriers of memory. They were keepers. The chamber dimmed. Silence returned. The path behind them felt different now, not an invitation, but a threshold crossed. The path ahead, deeper into the mountains, waited. The valley had awakened. The mountains had answered. And now, the world beyond would begin to stir. The chamber's lingering glow faded into a muted twilight, leaving the three of them standing in a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like a moment of reverent transition. Their breathing was slow, steady, synchronized without intention. Somewhere deep in the earth beneath their feet, an ancient pulse thrummed gently, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, acknowledging the presence of its new keepers. The air inside the cavern grew warmer, subtly infused with a scent, like pine resin mixed with distant ocean spray. Inhaled with wonder, the seed, the ring, all of it. It's inside us now, she whispered, not in alarm, but in awe. Elias nodded, feeling the strange, calm fullness behind his sternum, the sensation of having swallowed a secret older than the continent itself. Jonah rolled his shoulders slowly, as if adjusting to new weight, though the weight was not burden but responsibility. A soft glow appeared at the far side of the chamber, an opening they had not noticed before. It had been concealed by shadow, or perhaps only revealed once the seed recognized them fully. The entrance was framed by stones etched with delicate symbols that flickered faintly, illuminating their edges like the embers of an old fire being coaxed to life. The three exchanged a look of unspoken agreement and moved toward the passage. As they stepped through the archway, the air changed again. The warmth of the cavern gave way to a crisp, clean breath of cold mountain wind. The passage sloped upward, the stone floor uneven with age, and soon the darkness thinned into a soft gray light. They emerged onto the far side of the mountain, a vast ridge stretching above a forested world far larger and deeper than what they had crossed before. The sky was layered with clouds moving slowly, heavy with snow or rain, or some unnamed transformation. The wind carried a low, distant hum, the voice of the land shifting in ways subtle and profound. Below them stretched a forest, unlike the one they had known. The trees here were older still, their trunks wider than houses, their branches draped with strands of silver-green lichen that swayed like ancient banners. Rivers wound like serpents through the valley below, their courses glittering faintly with mineral light. Birds with dark wings circled above treetops, calling out cries that echoed strangely, as if rebounding across eras. Exhaled slowly. This is another valley, untouched, preserved. Elias crouched and placed a hand on the ground. The soil hummed faintly, carrying the unmistakable resonance of memory. And it's connected, he murmured, part of the same network, but forgotten by even more layers of time. Jonah squinted toward the horizon, where peaks stretched endlessly, and the path continues. They descended the ridge, navigating steep rocky slopes, softened in places by thick mats of moss. Every so often, the memory seed within them pulsed gently, nudging their steps, indicating a direction, a careful turn, a safer footing. It didn't speak in words. It guided like an instinct born, not from survival, but from understanding. As they reached the valley floor, the air grew warmer again, filled with scents they didn't recognize, flowers, emitting notes of cinnamon and citrus, earthy tones of moss, layered with hints of deep mineral sweetness. Paused to observe a cluster of strange blossoms, shaped like twisted shells. When she touched a petal, the plant offered her a memory. Children gathering the blossoms and grinding them for a dye used to paint ceremonial stones. She stepped back with widened eyes, her breath caught between wonder and gratitude. Elias pointed ahead, where a faint line wound through the trees. Look, another path. They followed it into a dense grove where the branches arched overhead to form a natural cathedral of interlocking canopies. Sunlight filtered down in wide, soft beams. The grove felt sacred in a way the cavern had felt ancient. There was peace here, deep, resonant peace that hummed like a whispered promise. At the center of the grove stood a stone circle similar to the one that had supported the wooden ring near the lake. But this one was larger, more intricate. On the stones rested objects arranged with care. Woven artifacts, carved wooden tools, pieces of pottery, bundles of dried plants preserved with astonishing skill. These were offerings, not abandoned relics. Someone had been tending this place. The three stepped forward slowly. A sudden rustling broke the stillness. Not animal, not wind, human. Inhaled sharply. Jonah tensed, hand instinctively touching the pocket where he kept his old harmonica, a habit from dangerous days in the logging camps. Elias raised a hand gently, signaling for calm. From behind a massive cedar stepped a figure, draped in a thick, earth-toned cloak. The hood pulled low. The person stood quietly, posture relaxed, though surrounded by an aura of watchfulness. When they lifted their head, the hood fell back. A woman middle-aged, with silver threaded through dark hair, eyes deep as forest pools, and bright with a mixture of caution and recognition. She spoke first. "I have been waiting for you." The words were simple, but their weight rippled through the grove like a stone dropped into still water. "Waiting," Elias echoed, stunned. "How could you know?" "The valley whispered," the woman said, stepping closer with measured grace. "The mountains murmured. The ring awakened. I felt the shift the moment it happened." I studied her closely. "You're a keeper." The woman smiled gently. "A caretaker, perhaps. A descendant of those who stayed behind. A guardian of what remained when the network fell silent." Her eyes flicked from Elias to Jonah. "And now the silence has ended." Jonah frowned. "Are there others like you?" The woman's expression softened with something that might have been sorrow or longing. "There were," she said quietly, "long ago. But time is not always kind to those who keep memory. Some were lost, others left. A few chose sleep instead of awakening." She touched her hand lightly to one of the stone offerings. "I have tended the remnants, kept the traditions alive, watched over the ancient pathways, and I knew one day the seed bearers would return." I stepped forward. "What is your name?" The woman hesitated, a small, almost reverent pause. Then she spoke it softly. "Lyra." The name settled into the grove like a leaf drifting onto still water, quiet, graceful, instantly absorbed by the land. Elias felt the memory seed pulse, recognizing her. Lyra gestured for them to follow. There is more you must see. Your presence has awakened things beyond this valley. The land remembers differently now. As they walked with her deeper into the grove, the trees widened, revealing a hidden settlement, small, humble shelters built from cedar and stone, nestled seamlessly into the landscape, half hidden beneath vines and boughs. Smoke curled from a fire pit in the center, its scent rich with herbs. This was not a large community. It was a remnant, a living fragment of a world once connected across mountains and rivers. Lyra turned to them. Our numbers are few, but our purpose remains. And with you here, the purpose must grow. Elias swallowed. What must we do? Lyra's eyes gleamed with a mix of gravity and hope. You must restore the network, she said softly. Reconnect the memory keepers scattered across the land. Awaken the sites that sleep beneath mountain, desert, forest, and coast. His heart beat faster. There are more places like the valley. Many, Lyra answered. More than you can imagine. Jonah looked toward the distant peaks and the mountains. Lyra nodded slowly. The mountains hold the oldest truths, but also the deepest dangers. Elias exhaled, feeling the story unfolding beyond anything he had ever studied or dreamed. When do we begin? He asked quietly. Lyra smiled gently, the firelight flickering in her eyes. You already have. Lyra led them deeper into the settlement until they reached a small structure built partially into the hillside. Its entrance, woven with branches and dried herbs that released a warm, comforting fragrance when stirred by the wind. Inside, the chamber glowed with a soft amber light from candles set into niches of the stone walls. At the center lay a circular table carved with spirals, each one branching into thousands of tiny interconnected lines. It resembled the internal map of a great tree, or the pattern of rivers feeding an ocean. This is the map of continuance, Lyra said, her voice low. It shows the entire memory network as it once was. As Elias leaned over it, the spirals flickered to life. Tiny points glowed across the table, illuminating ancient sites, valleys, mountains, coasts, deserts, each a hub in the old lineage of knowledge. Hundreds of lights, thousands, and all connected by threads of soft, golden luminescence. It was never just one valley, whispered. Never just one ring. No, Lyra said. The valley where you began is only one route. But when the network fractured, each place dimmed. Some went silent Some fell to ruin, but the memory seed, and now the merging of the ancient ring, has reignited them. Jonah watched as faint tremors of light traveled between points. The network was awakening again, thread by thread. But then something dark flickered across the map. A shadow, subtle yet undeniable, slid along the outer edges of the illuminated spirals. It pressed gently against one of the ancient nodes, then another, dimmed one to a faint pulse, and moved on. Lyra's expression turned solemn. The fracture that broke us once did not vanish. It became a quiet hunger, a forgetting, a slow unraveling of the bond between memory and land. If the network is not fully restored, the forgetting will spread again. Elias felt the weight of destiny settle firmly on his shoulders. So this is the choice, he murmured. Restore the memory, or watch the world collapse into forgetting again. Took his hand gently, grounding him. We've already begun, she reminded, and the network is responding. Lyra nodded. You have woken the valley and the mountain. The next keepers will feel it. They will find you when the time is right. Outside, the wind stirred not harshly, but with purpose. The trees creaked, their voices layered with resonant warmth, as if they too felt the shift in the world. Elias stepped out of the chamber first. The sky overhead had cleared, revealing a sweep of brilliant stars. But now, patterns among them glimmered faintly, aligning with the spirals on the map of continuance. The heavens themselves seemed to be remembering. Stood beside him, watching the constellations pulse softly, answering the land below. Jonah, hands tucked into his pockets, breathed deeply, feeling peace settle into him for the first time in decades. Lyra joined them, her cloak brushing the ground like the hush of turning pages. The story ends here, she said quietly, and begins again with all of you. Elias closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him, the wind, the warmth of the seed within him, the sense of an entire world waking from long slumber. Felt the memory of the valley, the echo of the lake, the voices in the cavern, all merging into one seamless truth. Jonah bowed his head, honoring the ancestors who had guarded the memory before them, and the mountains listened, and the trees whispered, and the earth hummed. A final pulse from the memory seed radiated outward through the valley, over the mountains, across the ancient network, lighting paths not walked for centuries. The forgetting, light returned. The world of quiet memory exhaled, whole once more, and for the first time in thousands of years, the land carried its entire story again. Next second stories. Welcome to the Unveiled Epic Echoes channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery. In the long hush of Nevada's high desert, where the highway eases itself across emptiness, and the stars feel close enough to touch, there sits a motel that most drivers notice only for a flash of neon and a promise of coffee. The Meridian Sleep. It perches on the forgotten stretch of a two-lane road that used to carry more people before the interstate took the foot traffic and left the slower stories behind. And the motel's sign, a tired blue rectangle with peeling letters, hums and buzzes under the slow turning of the sodium. The place is unremarkable in a way that makes it remarkable. A single story of stucco and glass, a row of rooms with heavy doors, a small office where an ancient television plays static at odd hours, and a breakfast nook where stale muffins wait for guests who are always just passing through. The Meridian Sleep would have been easy to forget entirely, if not for one thing: its security cameras. They are old lenses with newer chips, angles constantly adjusted by an unseen hand to keep watch on the parking lot and the gravel paths behind the rooms. And in the small towns, gossip, the cameras had become a curiosity, the sort of item that generated talk in front of the hardware store and in the church lunchroom. They carried an unfashionable label. They believed in catching things, but cameras, like people, are only as useful as the stories you bring to them. The first to notice the oddity was a young archivist from Reno who had lived her life in indexes and boxes, and who had come to the Meridian Sleep one late autumn evening because the motel was cheap, and because the highway between assignments had nothing better to claim her time. Was the sort of librarian who listened to the hiss of microfilm like other people listen to music. The motion of a page turn calmed her. She found meaning in small details. She booked a room, sat with the motel's coffee, and watched the parking lot through the office window while she made notes. The feed the motel kept on a herky-jerky monitor in the office was supposed to be prosaic: cars arriving, people carrying duffel bags or folding chairs, the occasional trucker who preferred the gentle anonymity of a roadside motel. But that night, as fog from the distant playa rolled in like a low cloud, the monitor registered something else. A man, pale under the sodium light, stepping out of his car and walking toward a room, his figure casting a shadow on the asphalt that in itself would have been ordinary, but with the archivist's attentive eye, noticed immediately that the shadow did not move in the same rhythm as its owner. The man's footfalls arrived, and his shadow lagged a beat behind. And when he reached the door, the shadow bent, as if to produce a coat that the man himself did not wear. The image was cold and technical, and yet it carried an uncanny poetry. The shadow, shaped like someone else altogether, bowed, turned, and then slipped under the motel door before the man had finished unlocking it, frowned because archives do not behave like theater. She rewound the feed, played it again and again until the motel owner, a wiry man nicknamed who wore the same cardigan every night like a uniform, wandered in to ask whether she wanted a second cup of coffee. He leaned over the monitor, squinting. "Stories, huh?" he muttered, which could mean anything in a place where the past and present often braid without permission. They brushed it off as a camera glitch, an artifact of low light and older hardware. The next day, a traveler left a review online about odd shadows, and the review burned through the small towns, quiet like a match in dry sage. People remembered, people laughed. Someone else posted a grainy clip to a forum where night people trade curiosities. The internet, relentless and curious, amplified what the motel's world already knew. The cameras showed guests entering with shadows that weren't their own. That phrase became shorthand, a small myth for the road. The pattern did not stay gentle. It grew specific. Different nights, different rooms, shadows that belonged to other shapes. Old women with shopping baskets when the occupant was a young man. A miner's silhouette with a lamp where a business suit stepped through. A child's tiny hand stretched from the darkness, though no child accompanied the guest. In the not quite dark hours, when the highway's heartbeat thinned to a distant hum, and the motel's neon flicked as if remembering the sign of a relay station, the camera's archive accumulated a series of mismatches. Living bodies crossing thresholds, accompanied by shadows that seemed to belong to other times. The phenomenon sparked a slow-moving, polite panic among the motel's regulars. Tourists rolled in with IR cameras and paranormal kits. Local journalists arrived to film and move on. The Meridian became a measured curiosity in the long list of roadside oddities. But the story needed someone to listen like a reader searching a ledger, and kept coming back. She began transcribing the camera footage, notating details as if it were evidence rather than spectacle. She cataloged the dates, the room numbers, the times 207 M 313 M 101 M, and she cataloged the shadows. Patterns emerged at her desk in the morning light. Certain shadows returned to particular rooms, repeating like a favorite refrain. The miner would appear in room 7 3 times that month. An old woman with a wide-brimmed hat would accompany different guests, but always at 3:13 M. The shadows were not random specters, but regular visitors, with routine and rhythm. His fingers trembled at the margins of her printed notes when she noticed one detail that made the hairs on her arms rise. The names stitched on guest robes, the initials embroidered into towels, the license plates in slow focus. Each living person the camera captured had connections to the nearby landscape. A man traveling through on a work visa once worked on a site that had been a 19th century settlement. The family on vacation had ancestral markers in county records. The motel, it seemed, was a crossroads not just of passing people, but of histories folded into the land like thin leaves. Curiosity drew her deeper, and she found allies in places she had not expected. A local plumber with a hobby for late-night radio shows about strange phenomena spent his idle hours tracing water lines and listening to the old men who lingered at the diner. He'd watched the feed with on and a beer in hand, and had seen a shadow take the shape of a dog no one in the world could remember. He told stories about the valley's past, the railroad camps that had been here in the Golden Century, the Basque who moved flocks across those low hills, the miners who sunk tired hands into the earth and sometimes never returned to the light above, the Paiute families whose oral histories spoke of moving waters and buried lakes before the desert became a wide plain. Asked the motel owner about the land, had lived in the town long enough to be woven into its fabric. His grandfather had been a station master before the line closed, and the trains slowed their poems. He listened too, and his cardigan shivered with a memory. "This land keeps names," he said one dusk, voice low. "Not all of them are ours to take. Some get stuck in places, like things behind a door. Cameras might wake them up. That idea, names or presences, stuck to places like burrs, fit the footage with a logic that felt less supernatural and more like a different branch of natural law. Names and stories, it seemed, could be displaced by the disruptions of settlement and mining and the carving up of land, and those displaced fragments might cling to crossings where bodies happened frequently, who had made careers of making order out of disorder, set out to test the theory like a scientist with a softer hypothesis. She began to match the shadows with names found in old county ledgers, railroad manifests, and the brittle pages of local newspapers that smelled faintly of nicotine and age. A miner's shadow matched the silhouette in a photograph of a man named Thomas Wren, who had died in 1897 when a tunnel caved in. The wide-brimmed woman matched a midwife, Lydia, who trained others along the old route before the highway was paved. The more matched, the more uncanny the correlation became. Each shadow belonged to a person who had belonged to the place in some intimate way. A person who had no adequate resting record, because their stories had been squeezed out by maps and modern claims. The motel's cameras were not making up ghosts. They were showing shadows of people whose biographies had been lost from the living record. That loss had a geometry. When the railroad rerouted and mining operations shut down, the patterns of human movement changed. Habits folded like paper boats. People who had anchored the land's memory drifted away. Their names fell silent in official registries, but their presence remained, like scent embedded in clothing. The Meridian sleep, with its low light and low traffic, became an accidental stage where the old and new crossed. The more learned, the more complicated the ethical field around the motel grew. To what extent should these echoes be disturbed? Were the cameras rescuing names or exploiting them? Whose work in archives had taught her the tenderness due to fragile documents, began to approach the motel not as a carnival, but as a conservator approaching a living artifact. She recruited anthropologists and a small group of Paiute elders from a nearby reservation who had long maintained knowledge of the land's older names. They came under the condition that she treat this as field work with respect. In quiet sessions around the motel's coffee urn, the elders spoke of property lines as wounds and of the land's memory as an elder's gum. Sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, and always honest about who had paid attention. They taught how to listen differently to the weight of silence in the late hours, to the pitch of a shadow's arrival, as if it were a tone in a long song. One elder, whose voice carried the cadence of desert wind, told a story about a lake that had once been larger than memory, lake, which in ancient times had cradled whole communities. As waters retreated and new owners claimed dry beds, people scattered, and some names flowed downstream into the bone of the earth. The land remembers not only what it was given, but what was taken, said, palms splayed like open books. She described rituals that did not attempt to force spirits into boxes, but that invited them into conversation. Offerings of tobacco and cedar, the telling of names aloud, an exchange in which memory was recognized and reciprocated. The motel became, under soft insistence, a room for recognition. The cameras remained, but their role shifted from surveillance to witness. Rather than broadcasting little clips for clicks and thrills, the footage was archived with care, tears and voices, annotated with research-grade notes and context. For those who came with curiosity alone, there were explanations and boundaries. No one disrupted a room's quiet without consent. The motel staff were briefed on how to respond with respect if guests encountered something they could not explain. The community garden behind the office was planted with seeds from heirloom varieties once cultivated in the valley to create a living archive. The shadows did not diminish because of these changes. If anything, they shifted in tone. There were nights when a guest reached for a towel, and the camera recorded the towel unfolding into the exact shape of the hand of a seamstress, remembered only by a ledger entry. There were mornings when the office would find small tokens by the vending machine. A button that matched a jacket seen in a photograph from the 1920s. A coin with the patina of many palms smoothing it over decades. The town began, quietly and thoughtfully, to reclaim its own memory. But the story takes its quiet into deeper, older truths, and discovered one such seam when she found a set of lab notebooks tucked behind a false wall in room 5. A place where guests sometimes complained of cold drafts that ran like little lanes of time. The notebooks belonged to a man named Edgar, who in the 1930s had been a geologist cum collector, intrigued by the pale lakes beneath the desert soils. His writing was meticulous and personal. He noted not only strata and sediment, but names he had heard from Paiute informants, long lists of places that had been drowned by changing climates. In one entry he wrote, softly, and in a way that made his throat tighten, that shadows are not always the residue of the deceased, but sometimes the print of decisions. When people appropriated land, when they rewrote maps, shadows of the dislocated sometimes adhered to the places left behind. There was a moral fracture in sentence, and felt it like a small stone stuck in her shoe. These were not malevolent hauntings. They were markers of injustice, encoded in the quiet material of place. The cameras, accidental and honest, had pulled back a curtain. The motel's flickering monitor, once a place to watch cars, had become an index to social amnesia. People began to test the theory more deliberately. Led a ceremony in the parking lot one spring, where the town and visitors unwound names into the night, family names, the names of those who had worked on railroad ties, the names of women, of Basque shepherds, of a boy who had drowned in the lake, and whose steering for a boat had been the last strong thing he completed in life. They spoke them aloud, not as exorcism, but as recognition. Thomas Wren, Lydia, little Eli, son of the lake. The motel's cameras, repurposed as witnesses, recorded the names like a soft chorus. And something happened, nothing dramatic in the way movies promise, but a change nonetheless. The shadows in several clips eased, as if a hand had smoothed a wrinkled sheet. The miner's silhouette that had once apparated in room 7 traced the doorframe once more, and then, in footage that the archivists watched together in a hush, the shadow paused, The figure's shoulders slumped as if in relief, and then it rose and merged back into the night with a slowness that suggested not leaving but going home. These events did not resolve every wound. The motel's cameras still captured many mismatches, and sometimes a shadow intensified rather than eased, tethered to a guest arriving with unresolved ties. One guest, a young man named Liam, who had driven through after visiting a grave that had been vandalized, brought with him a shadow that matched a landscape of broken fences and shouted ownership. In his room, the cameras showed the shadow packing like an animal in a cage, while Liam slept and muttered, realized then that recognition alone was not always the remedy. Action was required. If a shadow belonged to someone erased by broken law or stolen land, then the living had to do more than speak a name. They had to make amends in a practical way, and worked to draw attention to the contested histories documented in county records, poor deeds, coerced sales, lands acquired under the old logic of expansion. They partnered with lawyers to provide pro-services to families whose land claims had been brushed aside. And the motel's quiet office became a meeting place where legal papers could slowly be sorted and histories could be restored. The cameras, which had first felt like uncanny witnesses, became instruments of accountability, recording not only the uncanny, but the human work of redress. As the processes unrolled, a strange reciprocity appeared. In rooms where a tangible, practical action had been taken, restoring a headstone, returning a parcel of land, funding a conserving trust, the camera's footage recorded moments of gentleness in the night. Shadows that once were strained with longing relaxed. A child's silhouette reached an arm toward a guest's hand in a gesture that could be read as gratitude. A miner's bent shadow straightened. The meridian sleep became, without fanfare, a place where the living could meet the claims of the past, and where cameras, once the object of lurid exploitation, served the slower purpose of memory work. Yet with the reassurance of progress, the motel's history grew stranger in ways that would have seemed impossible had the town been content simply to reassign names on a plaque. One evening in late autumn, watched a clip in which a guest, a woman named who was researching her family's migration, arrived carrying a box of letters she had found in her grandmother's trunk. Her shadow was ordinary enough, but the shadow that followed her bore the shape of a man wearing a long duster coat. And when the motel's door clicked closed, the shadow moved differently. It lingered by the van, touched it as if to check for damage, and then walked toward the desert with a strange, deliberate gait, rewound and paused, within the frame, behind the shadow, a pale streak remained, a thin line of lighter air that the camera seemed to think was part of the image, but which could not be explained by dust or light. She increased the resolution. The pixels grew, and as she did, the pale streak resolved into a map made of dust. A faint diagram of a route across the playa, with little crosses at certain intervals, and one final circle where the map ended. The motel's cameras had not only shown who used to belong to the rooms, they kept the traces of journeys that unfinished lives once attempted to make. The motel's archives became a repository not only of names, but of directions, routes that had been cut off by history, trails that had ended in misfortune. The map in the footage hinted at a place on the far edge of the playa that had been marked with a cross, and with a handful of volunteers who had become patient friends, reluctantly sympathetic. A grandson of a Basque shepherd who knew how to ride the low rises like a memory, followed the map on an early spring morning when the light lay flat and forgiving across the desert. They found, beneath a thin shale crust, a concrete marker, half buried and standing like to the earth. Its inscription was faint but legible. A name, a date, a small note of apology scrawled by someone who could not sleep. The marker was for a labor camp that once housed temporary workers who had to sign their names away to survive the boom of a short season. It had been an erasure made legal by a system that thought in profit margins. And now, the motel's cameras had shown them the path back. The work of remedy widened. Not every wrong could be undone. Not every life could be made whole simply by speaking a name. But to identify wrongs and to act upon them, this mattered. The Meridian's small office grew into a modest center for restorative acts, funding small memorials, paying for markers, helping return a parcel of land to a family whose great-grandparents had been shepherds. The town's pace slowed around the motel. The diner with the friendly owner who made coffee into an art form became a place where people planned acts of restitution between fry-ups. The motel, once a place of passing strangers, had become a place where the past could be met by the present with integrity. Through it all, the cameras continued to offer their slow testimony. One night, during a thunderstorm that made the flat desert sing with the smell of hot stone, watched a clip that made her cry without being melodramatic. A guest named Henry had traveled through to scatter his wife's ashes near the playa. He was tall and careful, a man who had learned to speak softly with grief. The camera by room 7 captured Henry standing on the porch in the rain, the white of the motel's light pouring over him. his shadow fell on the ground, and in that shadow the camera recorded, for the first time on their feed, an older woman stepping out from beside him, the outline of her hair pinned back like a woman who had known how to keep a household in hard times. She touched Henry's shoulder, and the two of them, man and shadow, stood in the rain, as if sharing a single breath. Then, without fanfare, the woman's shadow rose, as if lifted by an updraft, and dissolved into a million tiny lights that scattered across the surface of the road like snow. Henry, unaware of the precise shape of what had happened, slept through the final shimmer, watched and felt something uncurl in her chest, the sense that even losses, which feel final, can be met in ways that are tender and private. The cameras, she realized, were not instruments of spectacle, but of care. The motel had turned into a sanctuary where the living and the displaced could touch in the smallest ways without being forced into show and into headline. And yet, the land keeps teaching us that memory is never a single, one-sided stroke. It is a field that needs constant tending. As the meridian sleep became known, it attracted those with less gentle purposes too. Treasure hunters who wanted artifacts, conspiracy channels seeking content, film crews who wanted the drama of things that go bump in the night. And the town resisted with a kind of quiet ferocity. They instituted rules. No filming without community consent. No commercial exploitation of clips of shadows. The internet's hunger for new content is enormous, but the town's appetite for integrity was stronger. The motel's archives remained closed to anything that sought to monetize grief. Time wore on, and small rituals established themselves as a quiet tradition around the meridian. Each autumn, the community held a night of names, a ceremony of remembrance where people came to say aloud the names of the lost, placing small stones along the parking lot's edge, setting out jars of water and cups of tea, letting candles burn low. The camera footage from those nights was kept in locked archives, accessible only to those who would treat it with the tenderness of a family album. The shadows, in turn, grew quieter. Some nights, the cameras captured nothing but ordinary crossings. Other nights, the old silhouettes still arrived, but their pace had softened into something like sleep, who had arrived to the motel in search of a cheap room, found in the slow work of restoring names, a vocation she had not expected. She began to publish careful essays that did not sensationalize the phenomenon, but described the moral work of remembering. Museums took notice, not the kind of exploitative displays she feared, but institutions that wanted to learn how to partner with communities rather than to own their stories. grants arrived to fund markers, to pay legal fees, to support the elders in their storytelling work. The Meridian Sleep did not become famous in a way that drove out its spirit. It became a place known by those who needed it, a quiet node in a larger network of memory keepers across the West who kept names like lanterns to guide the confused. In the end, the mystery of the shadows resolved not into a single dramatic revelation, but into a practice: recognition, action, and respect. The cameras had been the fluke that revealed a deeper structural forgetting. The motel was the stage where the living could be taught how to be responsible for the past. And the land itself, patient, had given back only when it saw the effort to repair. On a spring morning years, after first noticed the oddities, she sat in the motel's office with End and watched footage from a decade of nights. The videos played silently on the monitor, a long reel of the town's life and the land's response. In the images, the shadows appeared like punctuation, sometimes a question mark, sometimes a welcoming comma, sometimes a final period that closed an old sentence, placed a hand on the screen, which glowed faintly, and she felt an odd kinship with the people whose shapes had passed through. She remembered then a line from Edgar's notebook: "To notice is to be responsible." It was not a dramatic closure that rewrote history, but a slow, communal act of rewriting. Who counted as part of the place? The Meridian Sleep remained what it had always been: a simple motel on a long road. But it carried within its inventory a difference. The living and the displaced had learned to live alongside one another in a practice of attention and care. The cameras continued, small, impartial, and honest, just as any good archive should be. And the shadows kept attending sometimes, but the town had learned how to meet them. The desert that surrounds the motel, with its wide sky and patient stone, kept its ancient, layered truths. The Meridian, with its flickering neon, its old owner in a cardigan, and its archivist with a catalog of names, had become a place where long-forgotten people were spoken of again, and where their shadows, in the slow work of being witnessed and acted upon, were allowed to find gentleness, even if only for a night. In the months that followed the so-called calming of the Meridian Sleep, a quiet illusion settled over the motel and the town. People believed the shadows had softened, that the nightly disturbances were now little more than gentle echoes from a history finally acknowledged. And for a time, it seemed true. The cameras recorded less movement at odd hours. The mismatched silhouettes appeared only rarely, drifting through the lot like weary travelers ready for long rest, but began to notice something else. It started not on the cameras, but in the absence of footage, entire minutes missing, silent patches in the archives, black frames where there should have been the mild glow of streetlights. At first, she chalked it up to equipment aging, wiring fatigue, data corruption. But the missing frames grew longer each week, 20 seconds, then a full minute, then gaps expanding into dark holes of unrecorded time. Tried replacing the hard drives, burned cleansing herbs, and performed ceremonies that had always steadied the land before. Yet the gaps grew wider, darker, and more frequent. Something new was coming, something the cameras could not capture, or something the cameras refused to. The first real sign appeared one windless night in July. Room 9's camera feed didn't glitch, didn't blur, didn't jump, it froze. The frame locked onto the image of a man standing near his door, one hand reaching for the knob. The footage held him there as if time had gone still, but in the frozen frame, his shadow continued moving, slowly, deliberately, separating from his feet like a sheet of dark silk, peeling away from the body that once cast it. The man never noticed. He stepped into his room, tired, unaware, but the shadow hovered outside for a long moment, looking toward the camera with a stillness that felt predatory. Then the feed cut to black. When the frame resumed, the shadow was gone. The man was never seen again. His room showed signs of a struggle, but without noise, without witnesses. Sheets twisted, drawers half open. The window unlatched from the inside, though it had a security bar. The only mark left behind was a smear of black dust across the carpet, dust that shimmered faintly under the flashlight, as though containing flecks of glass or ash. Collected a sample under the microscope in her small storage lab. The particles shifted shape into patterns that did not belong to any known mineral. They reminded her of old photographs, the cracked emulsion on prints where faces go missing. Studied the particles and whispered, "Your cameras have peeled something loose, something older than the shadows we've known, something that does not want to be recorded, something waking." Over the next weeks, the disappearances, quietly, cleanly, without a scream, without a trace. First a trucker, then a hiker, then a family of 3 who checked in and never checked out, their luggage untouched, their beds unslept in. The security feed capturing their arrival showed a disturbing new detail. 3 silhouettes entering with them. But these silhouettes did not mirror human posture. They crawled alongside. They elongated and folded in ways no natural shadow should. And when the guests entered their room, the shadows slipped under the door like ink, moving toward warmth. By the next morning, the room was empty. Fear laid itself across the town like a blanket soaked in ice water. The diner stayed open later, its lights a small defiance against the growing dread. Locals refused to drive by the motel after dusk, stopped wearing his cardigan, instead carrying a lantern at all hours as another layer of weak security. And the desert changed. Birds stopped roosting near the motel. Hawks altered migration paths. Coyotes circled wide arcs around the building, refusing to cross the gravel lot even when hungry. The animals knew the motel had become a boundary line, a place where the unseen walked freely. One night, returned to the office to review footage when she heard a sound unlike anything the motel had produced before. A scratching, not at a door, not at a window, above her, inside the ceiling, like nails dragging across old wood, deliberately tracing patterns. When she climbed onto the desk and pushed away a ceiling tile, cold air rushed down, carrying the faint smell of wet stone. She shone her flashlight up into and something stared back. Not a face, but an absence, a hole of darkness, shaped vaguely like a person curled in on itself. Two dim, hollow points blinked open. Then it slid backward without moving its limbs, receding deeper into the dark, as though pulled by unseen strings, slammed the tile back in place and climbed down trembling. It was no longer just shadows. Something had crossed over, gathered the townspeople. The elders spoke in low voices about stories older than the paved road, older even than the mining camps, stories of beings who were not ancestral spirits, not ghosts, not echoes. They were called the Still Ones, beings that lived between light and darkness, feeding on absence, drawn to broken histories and unburied truths. They traveled beneath the desert in hollow chambers left behind by ancient lakes, moving in the spaces where memory collapses. And the cameras had awakened them. The cameras, in catching misplaced shadows, had peeled open thin membranes in the world. Moments of forgetting had been replaced by moments of invitation. The Still Ones had followed the old shadows, slipping into the motel through the windows of abandoned history. The missing guests were not missing. They were taken, pulled into the hollow spaces beneath the desert where the Still Ones waited, stubborn and trembling, but resolute, decided they had to go below. They had to find the hollow paths, the forgotten tunnels, the old lake beds where the dark fed on silence. She gathered, and each armed with lanterns, rope, and old maps from Edgar's notebooks. The markings he left behind matched the pale streaks captured on the motel cameras months earlier. A crisscross of routes leading into the old basins. At 3:13 m, the hour when the shadows were strongest. They left the motel lot and stepped into the desert. The night was a dome of quiet. Their lanterns cast feeble circles on cracked earth. They walked until the ground softened, until the crust broke, until a thin vibration trembled beneath their boots, like something breathing below. A fissure opened. Cold air exhaled upward. A whisper echoed from the darkness below. Not language, not sound. A vibration felt in her spine. They descended into the old lake bed, their lanterns flickering against damp stone. Tunnels stretched like veins in all directions. As they walked, the walls pulsed faintly, almost organic. And then they saw them, the shadows that did not belong to their bodies, walking beside them, growing taller, growing clearer. A miner, a midwife, a shepherd, a child, old shadows, lost shadows. But behind them, deeper in the tunnels, came the other shapes, the still ones. Darkness shaped into hunger. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly. Their bodies were silhouettes without origin. They did not walk, they folded forward, bending through space like cracks widening. Whispered, "Don't look at them. Don't think of them. Move." They ran. The tunnels twisted. The lanterns dimmed. Footsteps behind them, until the sound filled every space, echoing like teeth rattling. Then they found it, a massive cavern, the heart of the hollow world. In its center lay a pit glowing with faint blue light. The missing guests stood around it, motionless, eyes unfocused, expressionless, as though suspended between dreaming and waking. Their shadows were gone. The still ones had taken them, stepped forward, heart pounding, and spoke the only thing she could. "Take us instead." The cavern fell still. Then, a sound like 1,000 sighs exhaled in unison. The still ones crept closer. Shadows shifted. Lights trembled. The cavern pulsed like a giant lung, and the darkness folded inward. The darkness folded inward like a great wing sweeping across the cavern, and felt the air tighten around her throat, as if the hollow world itself had taken a slow, deliberate breath. The blue light rising from the pit flickered violently, stretching shadows into unnatural shapes that crawled across the walls like ink seeking new paper. The still ones advanced without sound, bending through space as if following laws older than gravity, older than the desert, older than the first footsteps that ever crossed Nevada's ancient lake beds. Grabbed his wrist and pulled backward, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't let them touch you. If they take your shadow, they take the part of you that remembers who you are." Pale and shaking, raised his lantern, but the light seemed to shrink from the encroaching darkness, trembling like a frightened animal. "They're everywhere," he said, his voice cracking. "We shouldn't have come down here. We shouldn't." A sound cut him off. Soft, sharp, like brittle glass cracking. One of the missing guests, the trucker, jerked violently as a thin line of shadow peeled itself from his feet, stretched upward, and snapped back into his chest. His eyes rolled white. Then he fell to his knees, gasping. The cavern pulsed. Another breath of the hollow world. Stepped closer, ignoring's warning hand. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man lifted his head, his face drained of all color. For a moment, his eyes focused on her, fully, painfully present. Then he whispered, "They want the ones who carry the names." Froze. "The names," she echoed. His mouth trembled, as if trying to speak something too heavy for the living tongue. "You brought them back," he rasped. "When you remembered the old shadows, when you spoke the names, you opened the path." His body convulsed. "And now they want what the shadows want." "What do they want?" Breathed before he could answer. The cavern wall shuddered as a massive figure uncoiled itself from the dark, taller than any person. Its body, a long, rippling absence. It had no face, but its presence radiated an ancient intelligence, vast and hollow. The still ones gathered behind it, like shards orbiting a great void. Inhaled sharply. "That's the first hollow." The creature extended an arm, if it could be called an arm, toward the group. As it reached, the air around it bent inward, sucking the lantern light into its form. Felt something tug at her chest, the memory seed of names she had honored, the histories she had uncovered, the responsibility she had carried quietly for months. The first hollow spoke without sound. Its voice arrived in their bones. "Return what you restored. Give us the names. Give us the shadows that belonged to us." Staggered backward, caught her shoulders. "They don't just want the lost names," whispered. "They want every name that has ever echoed across this land. They want to erase the living as easily as the forgotten." Raised his lantern again and shouted, "Why? Why are you taking people?" The first hollow turned its vast, empty face toward him. "Because remembering keeps the world awake, and we are the keepers of forgetting." Your cameras tore open the door. You showed the shadows their reflections. Now they hunger for every shape that was lost, and every shape that will be. The cavern walls began to tremble. From the tunnels came the low, rising rumble of thousands of hollow voices waking from sleep, realized with sudden certainty that the tunnels did not end here. They stretched under the entire desert, connecting abandoned mines, forgotten burial grounds, and dry lake beds where stories had once thrived. This was not just a haunt. It was a kingdom, and the still ones ruled it. Suddenly, the blue light in the pit surged upward in a violent column, illuminating the cavern with cold brilliance. The missing guests, still in their trance-like state, turned their heads in unison toward the first hollow. Their voices rose as one. "Take us home. Take us home. Take us." A gust of hollow wind roared across the cavern, silencing them. The pit dimmed to a dull glow, and out of its depths rose a staircase of stone that had not been visible before, narrow, winding, ancient. Its steps glistened with moisture and residues of centuries of shadows. His breath hitched. That staircase, it leads to the original lake, the heart of the hollow world. If they take the guests down there, they won't come back, whispered, gripped his rope, hands shaking. So what do we do? The first hollow raised both arms. The cavern darkened. The staircase began to pull the guests toward it, their bodies sliding across the floor as though dragged by invisible currents. His heart pounded. She thought of the motel, of the names she had learned, of the shadows that had softened, of the delicate balance between remembering and forgetting. She thought of how she had opened the door, not deliberately, but through care, through witnessing, through empathy, and she understood. The still ones were not evil. They were balance, but something had tipped the scales. The cameras had let in more light than the hollow world could bear. The names had been spoken aloud after generations of silence. And now the hollow places of Nevada wanted payment. Stepped forward, lifting her lantern toward the first hollow with trembling hands. "You don't want the people," she said softly. "You want the weight of memory. You want the burden. Take it from me." Gasped, shouted her name, but kept her gaze steady, though tears streamed down her face. "I've carried the names," she said. "I've restored them. I've honored them. If someone must balance what I disrupted." She pressed a hand to her chest, over her heart. "Then take my shadow instead." The cavern fell silent. Every still one stopped moving, stiffening like stone. The first hollow lowered its head, considering her. The darkness around it flickered like distant lightning. Then it approached, footsteps silent, body bending the air itself, cold radiating like ancient winter. It reached for her shadow, whispered no, shook his head, tears streaking his dusty cheeks. "Please do," but closed her eyes, and the first hollow touched the ground where her shadow lay. When the first hollow touched the ground where shadow lay, the cavern shook with a sound like stone cracking beneath a glacier. A long, shuddering groan that vibrated through the air and the earth and the bones of every living thing in that subterranean world. The lantern light flared violently, stretching thin as if trying to escape, then guttered, leaving only the soft blue glow from the pit to illuminate its trembling form. Her shadow began to ripple, at first subtly, like a breeze moving across the surface of water, then violently, as if it were trying to tear itself free of her feet. It elongated in unnatural directions, stretching toward the pit, toward the walls, toward the ancient stairway descending into oblivion. The cavern air thickened, pulling at her breath. Gripped his arm. "Don't let go of yourself," she whispered fiercely. "Your shadow isn't just darkness. It's your map. It's where your memories live." But felt her memories already beginning to slip. Names she had held so gently. Histories she had restored so carefully. They blurred at the edges, softening into faint outlines. Thomas Wren, Lydia, the shepherd's son, the camp workers with unmarked graves. Their stories drifted like smoke. The first hollow inhaled and felt her shadow being drawn toward that vast, empty darkness. But then something unexpected happened. The other shadows in the cavern, the old ones, the mismatched ones, the ones that had belonged to people who lived, worked, and died across centuries of desert time, began to move. The miner's shadow stepped forward, separating from the trucker it had been clinging to. The midwife's silhouette drifted away from the motel guest, whose heartbeat it had followed for weeks. The shepherd's shadow uncoiled like a long-forgotten ribbon of dusk. They surrounded. One by one, they reached for her shadow, touching it gently, shapes of darkness, touching a shape of darkness. But the effect was unmistakable. Felt memories flood back into her mind as each shadow pressed against hers. The miner's grief, the midwife's long walks in winter, the shepherd boy's laughter, lives that had been displaced but not erased, gasped as the shadows encircled protectively. The first hollow recoiled, its faceless void flickering with surprise. Whispered, "They're choosing her. They're choosing to shield her." But understood something deeper, something older. "No," she said softly. "They're recognizing her as the keeper. She remembered them. She restored them. She gave them voice. And now they are giving her strength." I felt her shadow stabilize beneath her feet, no longer tearing, no longer stretching. Instead, it thickened, growing darker, richer, heavier, with every memory poured into it. She felt rooted, anchored, as though thousands of hands held her steady from beneath the earth. The first hollow screamed. It was a sound that did not belong to any world of sun or soil. A hollow, inverted roar, as if the absence of sound itself were being torn apart. The cavern walls trembled violently, sending chunks of rock falling into the pit. The staircase cracked down the middle, like a bone splitting. The still ones surged forward, their bodies bending and twisting with rage. Backed up, eyes wide. We need to go now. Grabbed his hand. You can't stay here. The shadows won't let you give yourself away. You're needed above. But kept staring at the first hollow. She felt something new inside her, something terrifying, something powerful. All the stories she had carried, all the histories she had restored, all the shadows that had sought recognition, they were alive inside her now. Said urgently, "The cavern is collapsing, move." But stepped forward instead, and the shadows followed her. The miner, the midwife, the shepherd, others older still, whose silhouettes flickered with faint memories of obsidian tools, reed baskets, lake-wet footprints from the time when water ruled the desert. They assembled behind her like an ancient army. The first hollow watched her, its vast form trembling. For the first time in its ageless existence, it stepped back, whispered, "What are you doing?" His voice was quiet, steady, filled with the weight of centuries. "I'm finishing what the land started." She lifted her hand. Her shadow rose behind her like a dark banner. The shadows of the forgotten rose with it, merging into a single massive silhouette that filled the cavern's dome. A collective memory given form, made visible, impossible to unsee. The first hollow screamed again, retreating toward the pit. The cavern shook so violently that massive cracks opened across the floor. Dust rained from the ceiling like a storm. The pit's blue light flickered wildly, then imploded inward, pulling air, stones, and shrieking, still ones into its collapse. Pulled toward the exit tunnel. "Take her hand. We have to go." Didn't move. The shadows behind her surged forward, their enormous combined form, pushing the first hollow toward the collapsing pit. The ancient being resisted, its body bending and twisting in impossible shapes to claw back its place in the world. But the shadows were stronger, not because they were ghosts, not because they were dead, but because they were remembered. The first hollow toppled backward into the collapsing pit, pulled down by the weight of every name had restored. Its scream faded into the depths, swallowed by the imploding hollow world. Collapsed to her knees, the shadows dispersed around her, flickering with relief, then dissolving gently into the air like dust trails caught in sunrise. The cavern groaned, grabbed by the shoulders. "It's over. You did it. We have to get out." Grabbed her other arm. "Move." The cavern ceiling cracked open. Boulders fell like thunder. Dust choked the air, and the three of them ran through the trembling tunnels, ran past the ghost lights flickering along stone, ran as the hollow world collapsed behind them, like an ancient lung finally exhaling its last breath. They reached the fissure. The desert night above was cold, wide, waiting. The cavern collapsed beneath their feet as they jumped free, and the tunnel sealed itself with a final boom of earth settling after centuries of unrest. Lay on her back beneath the stars, gasping, her shadow thick and steady beneath her, darker than the darkest patches of night. Sat beside her. "Are you all right?" I whispered. "I carried them, and they carried me." I laughed shakily. "We're never going back there again." But only stared at the motel in the distance. A single porch light flickered, not in fear, not in warning, but in recognition. Something had changed forever. For hours after escaping the collapsing cavern, lay under the trembling stars, her breath fogging faintly in the cold desert air, and sat close, keeping watch as the earth quieted beneath them. The tremors faded, the dust settled, the stillness that followed felt heavy and unnatural, as if the night itself were pausing to decide what would come next. When at last they stood, the desert floor beneath their feet felt different, firmer, steadier, yet humming with a subtle vibration, like something enormous deep underground had shifted position. The hollow world had not vanished. It had only recoiled, brushed the dirt from her knees, and looked toward the distant glow of the Meridian Sleep Motel. Its porch light flickered with a rhythm she had never seen before. 3 slow pulses, a pause, then one long bright flare, as if signaling someone across a great distance. That light muttered, squinting, "It's never done that before," frowned deeply. "It's reacting." "To what?" Whispered, looked at her, eyes full of meanings too old for words. "To you." They began walking back, crossing quiet stretches of desert brush, illuminated only by moonlight. The motel grew larger, its outlines warping subtly, with heat ripples rising from the ground, even though the night was cold. As they approached, an odd stillness settled around the lot. No coyote calls, no insect hiss, no distant hum of trucks down the highway. Even the neon sign above the office hung silent, though it usually buzzed like a tired wasp this time of night. Stepped onto the gravel, feeling the crunch resonate up her legs like the faint heartbeat of a sleeping animal. The porch light blinked again, 3 short pulses, one long. But now she felt it not in her eyes, but inside her chest. "It's calling to you," whispered. "You changed the balance down there. The motel can sense it." Swallowed hard. Buildings can't sense things. "This one can," said quietly. "It sits on a crossing, a place where memory pools. The shadows used it. The land used it. And now the porch door creaked open on its own. A warm draft drifted out, carrying scents of old paper, dust, and faint cedar. felt compelled forward, grabbed her sleeve. Careful, we don't know what's inside now. Nodded, but stepped inside anyway. The office looked almost the same. Threadbare rug, cluttered counter, old monitor stacks, buzzing softly. But something about the air had changed. It felt thicker, as if multiple pasts were layering themselves in the same space. The security monitors flickered to life the moment she entered. All screens lit up at once. Not with the parking lot, not with the hallways, but with recordings. Thousands of recordings. Footage she had never archived, never seen, never captured herself. Images spanning decades, sometimes a century, or more scenes from the motel's long, quiet history. Ghostly silhouettes walking corridors when the building had a different layout. Miners resting outside a structure that no longer existed. Dust storms rolling over foundations before the motel was built. A woman in a 1930s dress, hanging laundry on a line that now was paved over. A group of Paiute women singing in a circle on what was now the parking lot. A railroad crew hammering ties where the vending machine currently stood. All of it displayed simultaneously, layered in slow motion, like time unraveling into its original threads. Stepped beside, mouth open. This isn't possible. Touched one of the monitors gently. The motel is remembering. Then something happened that none of them expected. One of the monitors shifted, no longer showing history, no longer showing anomalies. It showed a room. Room 9. Empty. Door closed. Curtains drawn. But in the bottom corner of the screen movement, a shadow, but not the kind that clung to a person, not the kind that drifted free. This one was tall, too tall. It stretched from floor to ceiling, pulsing faintly as though breathing. Felt her pulse spike. I thought the first hollow was gone. You defeated one, whispered. But the hollow world is vast, and something else answered the vacuum. The shadow on the monitor tilted its head, looking at the camera, looking at them, cursed under his breath. It knows we're watching. The shadow lifted an arm, long, skeletal, bending in impossible angles, and pointed directly at the camera. The screen went black. A second later, the porch light outside flickered wildly. Something slammed against one of the motel doors. Another door rattled violently. Then another, and another. A chorus of hollow knocks echoed across the motel. A sound knew too well. It was the same knock from the cavern moments before the collapse. The still ones had not been wiped out. They had only been displaced. And now they were testing the boundaries of the motel. Grabbed his arm. Your shadow has become a keeper's shadow. That means you are now the threshold. Shook her head, I don't understand. You carry the weight of history. Shadows follow history. Another slam shook the motel's hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered above them, backed toward the office counter. If they break in, what happens to us? Stared at the monitors as they flickered, one by one, to strange, impossible images. Tunnels beneath rooms, cavities behind walls, a staircase spiraling downward beneath the foundation, rooms that no longer existed, and at the center of it all room 9, glowing faintly, as though lit from within by moonlight, filtered through deep water. Inhaled sharply, room 9 is becoming a gateway. Stared at it, feeling her heartbeat synchronize with the strange pulsing glow on the monitor. Why that room? His eyes softened with sorrow and understanding, because the man who disappeared there was the first to be taken after you started restoring the shadows. That room is where the hollow world found its way back, and now it wants you. Something scraped along the window beside them, a long, dragging sound, like a fingernail made of stone. Turned slowly. Behind the glass, a silhouette pressed close, featureless, tall, thin, its head tilting with curiosity, its shadow stretched across the window frame, spilling onto the floor like ink. Whispered, "We shouldn't be here." Nodded, "Correct, but you must be." Took a step forward. "Why me?" Answered quietly, "Because the hollow world listens only to those who listen back. You opened the door by hearing the forgotten. Only you can close it again." The shadow outside lifted its hand and pressed its palm against the glass. A dark ripple spiraled outward from the point of contact. Suddenly, every light in the motel snapped off. Total darkness swallowed the room. Then room 9's door creaked open down the hall. The sound echoed like a breath, drawn by something ancient. Whispered, "It's calling you inside." Stepped forward, shaking but resolute. "Then I'm going." Grabbed her arm. "No, you don't know what's in there." Looked at him with calm, steady eyes. Eyes that, for the first time, carried a strange darkness swirling in their depths. "I know exactly what's in there," she said softly. "Everything I've brought back." And without waiting for permission, she walked into the motel hallway as the shadows gathered, waiting. Room 9 glowed faintly in the darkness, like an open mouth. Stepped toward it. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the motel fell silent. The moment the door to room 9 closed behind, the hallway outside fell into a silence so deep it felt carved from stone. Pressed her palm against the door, whispering prayers in a language older than the desert. Stood rigid, lantern trembling in his hands. Inside the room, the air shifted, heavy, humid, as though the hollow world had exhaled through the walls. Took a single step forward. The The floor softened beneath her feet. The wallpaper peeled back like ancient skin, and the room stretched. It elongated beyond its own dimensions, unfolding into a vast, dim corridor that should not have fit inside the motel's geometry. The ceiling rose. The walls pulsed with faint light. The air tasted like old water and forgotten words. Shadows lined the corridor, hundreds of them. But these shadows did not belong to people. They belonged to moments, to memories the desert had stored for centuries. A woman crossing a dry lake with a basket of reeds. A miner lighting his last lamp before the tunnel collapse. A child running through sage with a wooden toy. A shepherd staring at storm clouds rolling over the basin. They watched with expectation, not malice. She stepped deeper into the impossible hallway. At the far end, something stood waiting. Tall, silent, hollow. Not the first hollow, but something older, something shaped by every forgotten story that had ever sunk into the desert floor. It raised its head, and she felt it enter her mind, searching for weight, searching for imbalance, searching for the place where the door had been forced open by memory. It found it instantly. Her heart, the place where she kept every name she had restored. The being whispered into her bones, "We want rest. We want balance. We want the world quiet again." Stood her ground. You can't erase them. They're remembered now. The being tilted its vast, empty head. Memory burdens the land. Shadows cling where they are no longer wanted. You brought them back. Now they cannot return to sleep. Felt her chest tighten. Images began flickering before her eyes. Shadows crowding hallways. Restless silhouettes packing empty rooms. Echoes of lives unable to settle because she had stirred them. She whispered, "Then what do you want from me?" The being stepped closer, its form bending like wind-shaped smoke. "A keeper," she swallowed. "I'm already one. Not above. Below." The words struck her like a blow. She understood instantly. They wanted her not as a witness, not as a bridge, but as an anchor, someone who would remain in the hollow world forever, carrying the burden of the restless shadows so the desert above could breathe again. A sacrifice. Her shadow stretched behind her, trembling. The miner's silhouette appeared beside it. Then the midwife. Then the shepherd. All the old shadows rose around her, forming a circle. They touched her shadow gently, then turned toward the ancient being. They stepped between her and it. They chose her again. The being recoiled, its hollow form rippling like disturbed water. They refuse the quiet. They refuse the forgetting. Whispered tears forming. They don't want rest. They want truth. The shadows surged, rising like a wall of darkness behind her, a collective memory refusing erasure. The ancient being shrieked without sound. The corridor shook violently. The walls cracked open, revealing the cavern network below, still trembling from collapse. Dust filled the air, shouted from beyond the door, muffled. "Mara, come back," turned toward the sound. The being lunged. The shadows shielded her. The walls trembled harder. The floor split, and the room 9, snapped back into itself like a rubber band recoiling, stumbled backward as the door blew open. A rush of cold air swept out, caught her arm. The room was dark inside, silent, empty, was gone, but her shadow remained on the floor, burned into the carpet like a permanent imprint. A memory that could not be undone. Fell to her knees, touching the dark outline with trembling hands. She gave herself to balance, she whispered. But as she spoke, the outline shimmered soft, warm, steady. Not fading, not trapped, holding. The motel lights flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the desert wind shifted. The shadows in the parking lot grew calm. The hollow world exhaled, satisfied. Had not been taken. She had become the threshold, the guardian standing forever between the world above and the world below. The motel would stand. The shadows would rest, and the desert would remember, quietly, accurately, because one woman carried the truth where others could not. The next morning, as the sun rose cold and gold over the basin, room 9's door stayed closed. But inside the security camera feed, shadow moved, not trapped, not lost, but watching.